Welcome to Whisper, the Contingent Workforce podcast that will feature industry leaders who may not always have the loudest voices in the industry, but whose perspectives are sharp, grounded in real world experience, and committed to humanizing the industry. I'm your host, Mickey Pelletier. To learn a little bit more about the show, Manish Senta is going to share some details on the background of this podcast. Manish?
Hello, everyone. We are super excited to bring you another powerhouse, a leader who has managed a huge complexity in the talent acquisition business. As you may remember, if you go back to our first few podcasts, the goal of starting Whisper was to really bring talent acquisition, which is an integral function, in the forefront of the audience. And our leader, Tracy Collin, is one of those powerhouse. Tracy Collin is the leader who is driving the talent acquisition program for GE Vernova. As we all know, GE is a giant house, and this is the business unit she's managing it. And one of the beautiful thing about this episode is she's really able to give our audience what does it take to manage a huge, large number of contingent talent, and these talent are directly impacting the business because they are integral function of the business. As always, I am delighted to partner with Mickey and Matt on this podcast. Our goal is to continue to go into the market, continue to find leaders who are great examples of how a good talent acquisition leader impacts the business, creates a value to the business, and most importantly, positions the business to be successful in this really, really competitive world. I hope you all enjoy Tracy's episode. I am Manish Senta, founder and global CEO of TechWisen, and thank you for spending time with us. Over to you, Mickey and Matt.
Thanks, Manish. And joining in hosting this show is Matt Fringley. Matt, why don't you say hello to everyone and introduce yourself?
Hey, Mickey. Great to be back with you again for another episode of Whisperer. Looking forward to talking with Tracy a bit more about contingent workforce.
Thanks, Matt. Agreed. Really excited to meet Tracy Collins. Tracy is from GE Vernova. Tracy, why don't you share a little bit more about yourself, your role, your background in the contingent workforce industry?
Sure, thank you. Um, Coming up next June, I will have hit 3 decades in this industry, so I am a lifer. I spent the first half of
Wow.
my career on the supplier side, so I've lived all of the different roles and actions in the temporary staffing world. And then the second half of my career, I switched over to the buyer side, where I have developed and stood up programs that didn't exist before, including implementing the VMS technologies. In my current role at GE Vernova, a lot of people don't know this, but GE spun off into 3 separate companies last year. And so GE Vernova is one of the standalone companies that formerly was known as General Electric. So I'm the energy division, and I run the global contingent workforce program operations. We're in over 100 countries. We've got close to 40,000 workers in our program, and that's what I'm up to today.
Well, 30 years, that congratulations on that. That is a really big deal. To be in an industry for that long. I remember hearing like our parents talking about like the 40th anniversary, or they're retiring after 45 years, and you think like that's forever. That's such a long time. And 30 years. I know I've been in the space 20 years. Matt, you're a little bit longer than myself, but yeah, those years add up. So congratulations on that. Obviously, you have a lot of experience in the space, and a part of our development in the industry is the self-reflection. So I want to start with asking you a little bit about yourself, things you've learned over time. If there's any feedback you've received about yourself that's really helped you, and how are you learning today? 30 years into it all.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm known to people who know me as a very passionate communicator. And I'm saying that in the very nicest sense of the word, right? I'm very passionate. You can feel the energy in what I say and what I do. But that can also be kind of a downfall. So I've had some great mentors and peers and leaders that have really kind of pointed out. I tend to speak very rapidly. I speak in volume, and to really be able to pay attention to the rate of speech and the way that you're communicating, I found to be very important. And as I've gone through my career, as you know, going from company to company and program to program, you find yourself working with all different types of, well, I'll call customers, right? Whoever the other party is. And in my current world, I speak to non-native English speakers more often than I speak to native English speakers. So I was really grateful for that feedback. I'm still working on it every day, right? Because that's my natural rate of speech is really fast. But I found that it's really, really important to pay attention to that because otherwise you could alienate a listener and, you know, it could be intimidating. It could feel rushed. It could make them think that you're stressed. And all of that gives the kind of the wrong environment. I want every customer to think that when I'm talking to them, they're the only thing I have to do today. So really being able to have that dialogue and listen and get to the root cause of what it is that they need and help them understand what it is they need to do or find answers. And so making sure that I'm paying attention to my side of the communication has been something that I've always worked on and I will continue to work on.
We work in such a global space, and we sometimes take for granted that a lot of folks outside of the US, English is their second, their maybe third language. And we are very privileged that English is a default language for a lot of the world, and everyone else is learning it. So I know that's been feedback and things I've had to take internally as well, working with folks from other countries where English isn't their main language and being able to speak a little bit more slowly, use different words, be able to go back and revisit things and make sure that what they're hearing and what I think I'm saying aligns with how they're interpreting it, right? Because particularly when you're building requirements or gathering consensus on, hey, this is the path forward, are we all saying the same thing? Does it mean the same thing to everybody? Matt, I'm sure you experience the same thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. And worked on many different projects as well globally. And the funny thing is, even when you're speaking from a native English speaker to another native English speaker, sometimes the same words don't have the same meanings, right? So when you branch that across other languages, as you rightly said, you definitely have to be mindful of what you're trying to communicate and make sure that message is clear, uh, regardless of whether it's written or spoken. So couldn't agree more.
I think you bring up such a good point, like just with our language, and if we're speaking English, like you to me, English to English, do we have the same definition? When I say direct sourcing, do you mean direct sourcing? And what do you mean by that? I think that's such a great call out outside of like language barriers and maybe cultural differences. Geez, just our own understanding of a definition here. I think that's a really good point that you bring up there.
I think another thing that came into play, especially after coming to GE Vernova, we write our user guides and we will use language like one of the words that was used was surplus. Well, that's not a word. Like if you think about when you're learning a different language, surplus isn't one of those in the first 500 words that you learn, right? So I've really tried to like in creating documentation and user guides and things like that. I've also tried to pay very close attention to what is the most common or basic form of a word so that if somebody's popping it into a translator to translate it, it's going to translate well. So, yeah. The global world is a big difference. It's not like it was 30 years ago.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
So you raised some great points, Tracy, just around commonality and thinking about how we communicate with each other. And I want to take a different view on something here and get your perspective on something specific to our industry, contingent workforce management. Do you feel like there's any bias in how companies prioritize the functions of HR, talent acquisition, and procurement more so than contingent workforce management? And what do you feel like is the real impact of that disparity?
Yeah, I do. I do think that there's a bias, and every manager that works with a contingent worker knows how absolutely critical that person is to their goals and their outcomes. And I don't think there's many companies out there that wouldn't, start to panic if the contingent workforce suddenly got shut down for a minute, right? It keeps us running. But when you look at kind of where it falls in an organization and kind of how it's treated, um, HR and talent acquisition are always focused on, employees. And rightfully so, that's their function. But it's kind of, I guess I've kind of always said like contingent workers would be like the stepchild. right? So it's one of those, it's not the one that they're focused on or that they're paying attention to. And in a lot of cases, what I've noticed is that HR doesn't really want to talk about contingent workers. They want to, if a question comes up about a contingent worker, it's handed off to the contingent workforce program team, wherever, or to the vendor, whatever the case is. Procurement is looking to get the right purchase of the right thing at the right place, at the right time, at the right cost, and rightfully so. That's what they're there to do. But they play a huge role as well, because they are the ones that would need to bring in the correct suppliers and make sure that those suppliers are set up to succeed. And so, I think there's a disparity there where employees have a dedicated, resource, and within procurement, they're looking at the buy, but then you've got these people that are in the middle, and they don't really fit somewhere. And so, regardless of where it sits in the organization, contingent workforce is typically kind of an afterthought for those types of organizations, like the procurement or the human resources organizations. And that's why it's so critical that there's a contingent workforce, industry out there that cares and is paying attention.
Well said. And I feel like that the more the world has shifted how work gets done, contingent workforce makes up a larger and larger portion of the total workforce. Every company has a different mix and ratio, but certainly every company has what we would consider contingent workers, and however shape or form they come in, whether it's true contingent where it's you're going through an agency and they're supplying that labor, or you're packaging it through a statement of work and you're buying it as a bundled good or service. It's all a form of contingent labor. And as you rightly said, if that workforce was to just completely go away and evaporate or just disappear for some reason, then a lot of the critical projects within most companies would come to a grinding halt. So the fact that more companies aren't paying enough attention to this and dedicating specific people, right? GE Vernova has it, which is great. You're driving that. But there are a lot of companies who still are trying to figure this out and they don't have a good grasp on it. So to me, the prioritization around talent acquisition and procurement, it all needs to come together because those two functions, and again, you said this really well, they have their core purpose, but they sort of melt in the middle where you have this contingent workforce that sits. And if you really want to get it right, you probably need somebody, whether they sit in procurement or whether they sit in HR, that's going to own this contingent workforce component and partner very closely with their counterpart, wherever the program doesn't sit. So I really appreciate your perspective on that because it's such a critical piece to, again, how most companies get work done today, that without the focus and the function that's being put there, you could see it will cause a lot of problems for a lot of companies.
Tracy, you used the phrase afterthought, which is something I've written about and spoken about. I think that's like a great way of describing how our industry can be viewed. Companies have 20, upwards of 50% of their entire workforce is made up of the non-employee contingent workforce pool, yet how many people are dedicated to that function of contingent workforce? One, two, three folks, plus maybe an outsourced MSP operation. Maybe they do have an in-house program, but then how many people are attached to HR? How many people are attached to talent acquisition? Granted, the things they're doing may be a little bit more employee focused, where contingent workforce, obviously, they're not the company's employees. They're somebody's employees, outside. But it just sort of highlights, that discrepancy in terms of your prioritization. Matt was the word you use, which I agree with. And, I feel that we certainly need that more in this space. And obviously our conversation, we have our own bias. We've seen the light and know how important the contingent workforce function is, whether you are a provider of staffing services or an MSP, VMS, EOR. But I always go back to the in-house, whether you're running the contingent workforce program yourself or you're overseeing an MSP, them being a central part of the strategy when you think of your workforce, because they need to be able to chime in with their expertise because it is niche. Tracy, you highlighted HR doesn't really want to touch contingent workforce. Right on. Throw it over to the contingent workforce person. You have the expertise, you have the background to explain why it is different from full-time employment. You have the perspective partnering with procurement of how it is more than just a line item and a budget item. That's part of the life cycle of engaging and managing this type of talent. But and so appreciate your perspective sharing that, because I think it ties together just some of that bias we see, and maybe it isn't always bias. I think it's just maybe a lack of education and prioritization of this function of contingent workforce. So staying in line with that theme of the procurement, talent management, and contingent workforce, a common discussion. I think we get into this once a month, and is certainly a topic that I think is so relevant. But you think about where contingent workforce ownership sits and the functions that go into it. Curious to get your perspective, Tracy, particularly around the balancing of this human aspect, with that financial needs, procurement elements of it all, and sort of how you see that tying together with where it sits within an organization.
Yeah, you kind of alluded to this in our a little bit earlier in the discussion, but I've always said that to truly be successful, a contingent workforce program really needs to be a marriage between procurement and talent management. So, and I say talent management because there's a full life cycle of talent, right? And you could be looking at pipelining talent, you could be looking at temp to hire, you could be looking at, you know, internal employees that are growing their career and then creating other openings. But if you have the ability to look at talent as an overall um, makeup of an organization and not just looking at the employees, but looking at all of the talent that you have, that's really going to be what gets you into the right resource planning and the right strategy around people. And there has to be that marriage with procurement, because procurement needs to be able to understand what types of talent are needed and what the business is and what the supplier mix needs to look like and what the types of suppliers are that you need. So, AOR and EOR and staffing suppliers. And obviously, we've all got statement of work suppliers with all the outsourced things that we do. And so, procurement really needs to have an understanding of that as well. And I see our role in the contingent workforce world, if we're really doing things successfully, and it takes a while to get there, right? It's not something you're going to do in a year, but when you come into an organization, you're standing up that program, you really need to be that person that's the matchmaker. You're bridging that gap. So, I had an experience in a previous position. It was beautiful. The person that I worked for actually led talent management, but prior to that, was the director of procurement. I'd never once met somebody that had a foot in both ponds really solid, solidly. And so our design and strategy and implementation went very, very quickly because we both spoke the same language in both ways. And I think that's wonderful. That's not going to be the case in most situations. You're going to have people who really know HR. You're going to have people that really know procurement and supply chain. And then you have to come in and be able to bridge that gap and make sure that each side understands the other perspective. And it's only folks like us that can do that because we're bilingual. We speak both of those languages. And it's a really pivotal role, and it's very, very crucial. The other piece that I will say with that is suppliers have to be set up in a way that they are equipped and empowered, um, to be successful. No contingent workforce program is going to be successful if you don't have the right suppliers and relationship with the supplier. So if you treat every single supplier like a commodity because it's a procurement transaction, they're not going to be able to perform well for you, and you won't be successful, and or you might think you're successful, but you are not going to be as successful as you can and should be. So there's multiple parties that come into play there.
No, but I love that perspective because um, my experience in contingent workforce, as you know from our prior conversations, it really spans being on the supplier side, like yourself, and the MSP side, and running programs. And I've seen it where people get too focused on one particular outcome. And oftentimes that's a procurement driven outcome, which is cost savings. And again, the program should have a cost savings goal, and those are important. And one of the reasons why you standardize a contingent workforce program is to drive efficiency and find where you have people spending way too much on certain things, and you can procure it at a better price. All well and good, but when you lean too heavy on that piece, sort of put the thumb on the scale on just lowering price, as you said, you lose that relationship and that desire. Some of your suppliers who know you best and know the talent that you need and how to get that talent to you don't prioritize your business, just to put it frankly, right? Because they might say, you know what, they're squeezing the price so low here, it's hard for us to actually turn any profit on this. It's going to put us at a break even point where we could take the same talent and they probably have another customer that could use that talent, and for them it's a better opportunity to make a little bit of profit in that. So I think it's a fine balance, right, that you have to play, because if you squeeze so hard on the cost savings piece, you put your supplier in a position sometimes that they're disincentivized to want to help you, one, and or two, I've seen it as well, and I've been on the receiving end of this as a supplier on the supplier side, where we had a client that we were doing good business with. They changed procurement leaders, and this individual really wanted to drive cost savings, and they put in such a low markup. And then on top of that low markup, they had said after 6 months, you're going to go down to what was basically a sub payroll markup. And we thought, surely this is never going to work, right? Like this strategy, the initial price is very low, but then after 6 months, if our contractor is still on site, then they're saying you're going to go below. So we're losing money to keep this person employed. We're not even recouping our cost of a payroll. And the guy was adamant, this procurement individual. He said, "No, you take it or you leave it." And I've got suppliers knocking on my door, and okay, fine. And we made the decision that it just wasn't going to work for us, and so we ended up walking away from it. This was a few years ago, and I've heard from others who also walked away. So I'm wondering. I know they still have a program, so I don't know obviously what's going on in it, but I am curious. I'm like, which of these vendors has agreed to work at these margins and be able to be successful and actually find good talent. So I would be curious to know more about where that sits today, and I only share that as an example because I feel like they just went too heavy into the one strategy and weren't thinking about the real human cost of, if I can't get people, meaning vendors, suppliers, who are interested in providing me high quality talent, and I'm not making it even remotely fair to them to do so, then your business will lose out. At the end of the day, the talent you need will probably go elsewhere. But I just really was, interested to hear your point of view on it, because I do feel like the best programs really are a marriage, as you said as well, of procurement and HR coming together to understand that this is something that is going to be critical for our business. And while these are not our employees, we still need to make sure that the people we bring in are treated fairly, as well as the vendors are incentivized enough to want to be here and want to support us and want to get to know our business and how we want to be successful. So yeah, really good perspective that you shared. Thank you.
The one call out that I was going to have was just, I really like what you say about the contingent workforce role. It takes a while to get there. Like it's not something you throw Tracy in and bam, you just got magic and the contingent workforce operations going to happen. A lot of elements that tie in, regardless of where you sit within an organization, but being that matchmaker, being able to speak all the languages between talent management and procurement, it takes a while to turn that magic on and really bring forth all the benefits of contingent workforce. And I fear sometimes that because it takes time, everyone wants this instant, savings, instant compliance. That perhaps, going back to our last question, maybe that is why it isn't as prioritized, because they don't see sort of the fruits of the labor right away. And it does take time to bring that, but when you stick with it, the magic, whatever comes forward, and you really start to see the benefit. I just wanted to acknowledge that, because I think that is something that we know, but maybe we don't highlight and acknowledge that, like many things in life, it takes time. If it was instantaneous, half of these roles and things that we need to do in the industry would exist, or excuse me, would not exist. So I just want to chime in with that.
No, and I think that's a great segue to the next question in it itself, because we were just talking about having the right supply base engagement. And one of the things I'm curious to understand from your point, Tracy, is you have a lot of experience both as a supplier and running contingent workforce programs, and making sure that you have the right supplier mix is important. So can you share some thoughts on what are the considerations that other leaders in contingent workforce should have when considering which suppliers to work with?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty passionate about that topic as well. Um, every company is different. So I've started 3 contingent workforce programs from the buyer side, and obviously on the supplier side, I've worked in many. Some of them I started up, and some of them I came into. But I'll tell you, the primary reason that I made the shift from the supplier side to the buyer side is because after sitting for whatever it was, 15 years on the supplier side, I always felt like I was the second class citizen in the room, even when I was an on site, on premise person, right? Living and breathing, company badge, had the polo shirt, all of it. I still always felt like kind of the second class citizen with the leaders that I was working with to supply the talent. And when I looked at trying to support programs that were in place, I felt like it was all no touch, hands off, operational, transactional. And I really just felt like it wasn't a way that we could succeed as a supplier in the way that we could with our retail clients, right? That partnership and the getting to know them. And I thought, gosh, there has got to be a better way to do this. And that's when I actually made the switch and went off to seek my fortune and came over to the buyer side because I thought there's got to be a different way to do it. Like I said, equipping and empowering the suppliers that you choose. So then you have to pick the right suppliers. And again, every company is different and they staff for all kinds of different skill sets and different locations. Some really want to have a lot more hands on if they don't have a large contingent workforce program and they just want to have a couple of um, primary suppliers that take all that lift, right, and do all that the the hiring manager hand holding and that sort of thing. That's one approach. Or you could have a program that's being run by a large MSP, and the MSP is doing all that operational work and kind of giving the information to the suppliers. So it's really important to kind of look at what does your company look like, and then what do you want it to be. For me, I always look at it and say variety is the spice of life, right? Always have your contingency plan. Um, so there are those great big suppliers that can do things on low margin, and they're very transactional, and they do things in volume. But you also have more of your boutique-ish or niche types of suppliers, and then you have ones that are just more general, but they're smaller. The smaller companies, um, they could be localized, geographically, they could be localized from an industry perspective. And then kind of going back to that conversation that we were just talking about with kind of having that marriage and speaking both languages and bridging that gap. I think it's really, really important to kind of take a look at, you say meet your customer where they are. Well, I kind of look at it and say you have to look at it as meeting your supplier where they are too. So I've seen procurement organizations say, I want everybody to pay on a credit card at 120-day terms, 180-day terms, right? Staffing that might work for a larger company, but staffing companies typically do weekly payroll, which means that they have to expend the money the week after it was earned. And they have to carry that balance on their books for 120, 180 days. That's a huge cost. And I think that's one of the things, if you speak the language and understand and again, that's kind of coming from the supplier side, I get it. But if you speak that language and you could help each side understand, you could, talking to procurement and saying, well, it's really not setting them up to succeed. It's going to create a cash flow problem because this money, it's not like you can order paper clips and then pay for paper clips 120 days later, but the person supplying the paper clips paid their supplier 90 days later, right? It's in real time. You have to keep up with that payroll cycle. So just things like that are really important to consider. Um, and trying to get the terms right, trying to get the interaction right. I personally don't have a no touch program. We don't allow any solicitation within the program. So if a vendor's reaching out asking a manager what recs they've got coming up, that's a problem and it will be addressed. But we don't want a no-touch program because we really want to make sure our suppliers are equipped to be able to know and understand the business in the same way that a recruiter in talent acquisition would get to know you and your business and the roles that you fill. So I just said a whole lot there, but you know, I definitely think that looking at different types of suppliers and kind of having a mix in that base is important. And if you are looking at, if you force kind of more of a commodity buy, like you were describing, Matt, take it or leave it. We've got suppliers knocking at the door. Well, I do. I do have suppliers knocking at the door all the time. But it's really about making sure that you've got something that's, fair, competitive, and attractive so that any supplier would want to, would want to play and be successful doing it, and not doing something that unintentionally pushes out potentially diverse suppliers or niche suppliers or specialized suppliers.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the thing that resonates for me, what you said there is, yeah, the suppliers knocking at the door. Absolutely. Anyone who runs a contingent workforce program knows that suppliers are always knocking. Suppliers know who you are, they know what program you run. They may not know anything about your program, but they know that you run the program. So they're knocking at the door. But your point was well said there, when it's like you have to make the program attractive, because just because they're coming and saying, "Oh, hey Tracy, put me in your program or we'll do a great job," as soon as they realize that, maybe you have 180-day payment terms at a really low markup, and there's other things like maybe high insurance premiums that are higher than what they carry. So now all of a sudden they thought they wanted this business, but now that they know what it actually looks like, maybe it's not attractive or even palatable for them, because as you said, they won't make enough money to make it worth their while and get their ROI. So I like that, the way that you described of thinking about the one size doesn't fit all necessarily, and or when you're thinking about what's going to work for your program, if you are going to standardize, think about it from the lens of all suppliers, not just the giant suppliers who can float some of those longer payment terms, have the cash flow and all the different things that go along with it. So really appreciate that insight.
A lot of good points here. One of the things I love about this show is just hearing all, the unique perspectives, but along the way, so much of it is very validating of things we've thought or things we've heard. And so it's refreshing that Tracy, the perspectives that you've shared. I mean, just kind of going back, your a point about contingent workforce programs and contingent workforce being an afterthought. I mean, that's something we really need to think of at the enterprise level of how we shift that perspective, whether you are the lone contingent workforce program owner or you are the VP of talent acquisition. And how do you shape and morph that to help that prioritization of the program, be stronger so it could be more of a strategic function within your organization versus just this standalone program, right? I think we need to shift things there. And then you talk about where the program sits and the role of the contingent workforce program owner, being that matchmaker, bridging that gap between procurement and talent management. I think that's such an important piece that we don't always think about in terms of the respect the role deserves for all that they're doing. And then I think it's really meaningful what you're talking about by empowering your suppliers. The old saying, you're only as good as the people you surround yourselves with. Well, I think that stands true with the suppliers you use. If you're using strong suppliers, well, geez, they're going to make you a little bit stronger. And if you're a good partner to them, it's going to benefit your program. And that stems into not treating it so much as a commodity, but as a functional strategic part of your business. And that ties into the suppliers that you choose to surround yourselves with. And I like your strategy of, hey, yeah, it is good to have some big global suppliers that you could sort of go to, and those are your standard A players. But then having, the niche, diverse, unique talent suppliers are good to have as well. I think it keeps the big dogs on their toes, but it also just brings a little bit more variety of talent and the ability to find the right mix of people that you may be looking for. So Tracy, this has been a lot of fun talking with you. Want to thank you for sharing your time with us and giving your perspective on so many things here. I think we could go on for probably another hour here, but thank you so much for being on the show with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great spending time with you, Tracy. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you all again.